Welcome to Faith Works Live. Here's your host, Romeike Haynie.
Welcome to Faith Works Live. It is my joy, and I mean this like my favorite thing, to be able to get on the microphone to talk about what it looks like to live out our faith in this crazy old, chaotic, mixed up world, so in need of the light, because the darkness is abounding, but it cannot overcome the light. In fact, the light has come into this world and the darkness has not overcome it. And that's our question is, all right, so we're following Christ. What does that look like on the day-to-day? I'm glad you asked. That's why we're here. Romeike Haynie is my name, and we talk about all kinds of things on this show. I know education is hugely important. That's something that we're going to center on today. Education, parents' rights. In particular, a news story that was almost like a blast from the past when I saw that the Romeike family, if you remember that name from over a decade ago, the Romeike family, they were a German family that was a Christian family that had fled to the United States. They were facing persecution from their own government simply because they, shock of shocks, decided they were going to educate their children at home. And this was something that their government did not take kindly to. So they looked for and found asylum in the United States. And all of a sudden, I see their name come back up in the news, and they are under persecution yet again here in the United States of America. This, my friends, shall not stand. And on the line with me to discuss this and many other issues of parents' rights and education, homeschooling and theology and whatever else, however else the conversation takes us, is Israel Wayne, who is an author many times over. He's a speaker. He's a worldview educator. He's been talking about subjects of homeschooling, education, and parents' rights for over 30 years. He's written many books on this subject. And interestingly enough, I love the approach of taking a biblical view. That seems like a good thing for Christians to do. Let's take a biblical view of what does God say about education and family and how these things should be intertwined, how they intersect. What is a parent's and child's relationship and responsibility? All of those things according to the Bible. And I've been looking to have you on the show for quite some time, Israel. It's my joy to have you with us today. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's my honor. I'm blessed to be here.
Now, as I said, we were talking about any number of things, and you actually happen to have a personal connection with the Romeike family.
I'm not close personal friends with them, but I met them about a decade ago when we were at a leadership conference in Washington, D.C. That was hosted by the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And they've been in the United States for about 15 years. They came here because they wanted to seek asylum, to see that their religious beliefs were protected. They had a belief that they needed to teach their own children and give them a Christian education. The difficulty is in Germany, they still have compulsory attendance laws that were written by Adolf Hitler, and they have never rescinded them. And so they have a ban on home education over there. There's several countries in Europe that are especially restrictive. Sweden, Denmark, Germany are some of the worst. And so France is moving that direction as well. And so they had come here as well as some other German families as well. The Romeike family is one that's kind of getting the most publicity, but there are others. Over a decade ago, my family was able to help provide housing for a different German family that had come to the United States seeking asylum. There are other families, like there's a young lady named Melissa Buscaros. Her family was, the police got involved, and they actually took Melissa, who was, I think, 15 at the time, away from her parents and put her into a mental hospital where psychiatrists tried to deprogram her and teach her to disrespect her parents, to believe that her parents were brainwashing her because they wanted to home educate her, and to teach her that this was not normal and this is not natural, and that she should be resentful because of her parents' desire to home educate. And in her story, which is a fascinating story in itself, when she turned 16, she had the presence of mind and the awareness to realize that their compulsory attendance laws only went to the age of 16. And so on her birthday, she actually jumped out of a window at this hospital and was able to run several miles, and basically, if I remember the story right, kind of hitchhike and catch rides and so forth to get to some family members, and then contact attorneys to let them basically to make a statement that she was not going to go back because they could not force her to stay since she was no longer under compulsory attendance laws. So thankfully, she had an awareness that was beyond her years and was able to physically escape from the German government. And somehow she was able to resist the programming that they tried to force upon her.
Yeah.
But the Romeike family was here living peacefully in the United States during the Obama administration in 2013. President Obama decided that the U.S. was not going to be a haven for families who were being persecuted for educational reasons, and that educational freedom was not a human right in his view. And so parents didn't have an innate or fundamental right to teach their own children. And so he passed an executive order that would force families, well, first of all, to stop families from being able to come in, but also that would then force these families to be deported. And Eric Holder, who was the attorney general at that time, ended up creating an exception clause that allowed the Romeike family to stay, and perhaps a couple of other families as well. And the real goal behind that was simply to try to get people to relax and not be upset about the executive order. And so it kind of worked in a way, because the families in question were able to stay in the United States. But now it seems a decade later that the Biden administration is moving to have this family and other families like them deported once again and sent back to Germany. It's from the information that we have right now, it appears that it's being done through the ICE agency, which is Immigration Services. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of things that we don't know, but I was able to meet with the Romeike family last week to talk with them. They are shocked. They have just had their first grandbaby. They have a daughter who is married that the government is also looking to deport, which is shocking to me. It's just an appalling situation, especially, I think, contrasting the fact that we have an administration in the White House that is allowing thousands of people to come across our southern border on a daily basis, with seemingly no desire whatsoever to stop the flow of many people. And again, we have to be careful we don't universalize, because there are people coming across the southern border for probably very valid reasons, that they're trying to get away from totalitarian regimes in Central and South America, getting away from Marxist influence down there, drug cartels, whatever. But there also are thousands of Marxists, thousands of drug cartels, people who are criminals who are coming up from Venezuela, from Colombia, from Mexico, and other places across the border. And so it seems really hypocritical that on one level, ICE is turning a seemingly blind eye to those individuals coming, masses of people coming across the border there. And now all of a sudden they're wanting to deport a family that's been here for 10 years, peacefully living, working, who came here legally, came through with all of the proper necessary legal channels, and that they are wanting to deport them simply because of their ideology, that they are homeschoolers, that they are Christians. And that is something that the Biden administration apparently does not want to have in our country. And so it's deeply disturbing. But the Romeike family is, while they're stunned, they are prayerful. They believe that God is in control, and they are doing their best to simply rest in and trust in the fact that God is sovereign. He has shown himself strong on their behalf in the past, and they believe he will continue to do that.
I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad you outlined the hypocrisy, because that's about the nicest thing that we can say about a situation like this. We literally have an open border. And what I mean to say is, yes, there may be a fence there, but everyone that comes through the gaps in the fence or crawls over the fence or around it, what they get is a number and a court date and a phone, and then they're released. And we don't know the intentions of everyone. We don't know the reasoning of everyone that comes in to apply for quote unquote asylum. But we know the government has no interest whatsoever, it seems, in stemming the tide of the masses, the hundreds of thousands of people that are crossing unencumbered over our southern border. And yet they specifically target a Christian homeschool family who has been law abiding in our country for over a decade and who have legitimate, absolutely legitimate grounds to be here under current asylum policy. And so the government has just decided, for no apparent reason, to rescind their blessing and deport this family. I don't know what possible justification you could use. They're allowing lawbreakers and they're allowing human traffickers and drug dealers. I mean, obviously, they wouldn't say that they're turning a blind eye, but I think the fruit speaks for itself. And yet this peaceful Christian homeschool family, no, they're the troublemakers. They got to go. Can't have them. Can't have them in our country. I see no other word for that other than persecution.
Absolutely. When they came 15 years ago, they had 5 children. Since the incident 10 years ago, they have 2 children who have been born here in the United States. So they have 7 children total now. And those children being born in the U.S. are U.S. citizens. And so I don't understand and know all of the details of how all of this is being persecuted and prosecuted. But I will say that as parents, even if those 2 young children were granted the ability to stay, if you as parents are being deported and you have to leave, you're not going to leave 2 young children in a country without you. And so it will affect those children as well.
Right.
Even if they are not being targeted. So yeah, it's a very grievous situation. They are requesting prayer. There is a petition that can be signed. We are looking for as many people as are willing to sign that petition at hslda.org. It's Homeschool Legal Defense Association's website. So hslda.org. And then you can look for the petition for the Romeike family. They're looking currently to try to get at least 100,000 signatures on this petition. And sometimes when there is a high enough profile and the government knows that many people are watching and that it will not go well for them, then I think sometimes they will back off of the situation. So having those signatures could be very helpful.
I have added my name to the growing list, and I'll link it down below in the podcast as well. If you search up the Romeike family, it's spelled Romeike, but just to make it easy, I'll link to this in the podcast too. So add your name because this is a miscarriage of justice. And as an American, I don't like that. And I don't want the government to do things like this in my name. So I do think we need to speak out and try to get as much attention as well as many prayers on their behalf as possible that justice will be done in this case. Now, Israel, you speak broadly about homeschooling, about the freedom to do so, about the rights and responsibilities of parents in the education realm. And that necessarily brings you up against the goads of government and government education because of the situation that we've created in America over the last 100 years. It's fun. So you're no stranger to conflict and to pushback, even from within the church. And I guess that's where my brain goes on conversations like the Romeike family, for example. Every single Christian should be up in arms. Every single Christian should say, this shall not stand. This is not acceptable that my government would target, especially given the glaring hypocrisy that we have currently, that they're going to specifically target, it sounds like, Christian homeschool family because, they're enemy number one, in the same way that we have pro-life families at being targeted, pro-life activists being targeted, our Department of Justice singling out Catholics for special attention, for example, religious people that are just not fitting the political profile of the people in that the people in power want. And that's ideological persecution, no matter how you slice it. But if every Christian was united, just limiting it to that on issues of parents' rights in the educational realm and broadly speaking, I think we would be able to, that in itself would change so much of the cultural confusion around these things. Why is it that we can't speak with one voice? And as I ask that question, I almost smile because it's no secret that the church has, many different opinions and that we're willing to fight amongst ourselves about a lot of things. It's sad, but true. Why can't, on something like this, what is preventing us from being able to be united around in humility and in confidence around the Word of God when it comes to issues of parenting and education?
Well, interestingly, that question leads us full circle, because the reason that many Christians do not think biblically about cultural and social issues is because they have not been informed predominantly by the scriptures on those issues. They have been informed by the government.
Okay, that makes
And,
sense.
85% of all young people in the United States attend government schools, and then many of them graduate and they go to government controlled universities. And so these young people are being indoctrinated in a leftist, progressive social worldview. And many of these people even become our pastors and church leaders. And so even if they go to a Bible college or a seminary, what they tend to be taught is basic Bible doctrine. So they believe that Jesus died on a cross to save us from our sins so we can go to heaven when we die, right? So they get this as kind of a Jesus plug-in to their worldview, but most of them have a very socialistic, left-leaning viewpoint as it relates to government, social issues, education, and so on.
Mhm.
And so their thinking is dominantly formed by the administration that's seeking to deport the Romeike family.
Right.
And so they have just received a lot of false information, a lot of propaganda that they've bought into. Even, for example, I've seen a lot of pushback on social media related to the Romeike family, where people are saying that Christians are being hypocritical and even racist, because they're saying, well, you're allowing this white family to stay, but you are against anyone who, is Latino or anyone who has darker skin color. You don't want them coming into the country. Well, that's just a false misnomer. I mean, it's a complete straw man. We are absolutely not saying that people should not come into the United States. That's not the argument. That's not on the table. We're saying there's a legal process that needs to be followed for people to go through immigration and come to the United States legally, the way that they have for a couple hundred years, or 400 years, depending on how you look at it. But in terms of the Romeike family, they went through all the legal processes. They didn't sneak here. They had gone through all of the necessary legal processes to enter the United States and to be able to live here. And so that's really what we're asking. We're really asking that people who come into the United States do it through proper legal channels, and that's the difference. It's not race-based. It is really the difference between legal immigration and illegal immigration. And so I think we have to be careful that we don't allow people on the left to spread misinformation and falsehoods like that, claiming that this is somehow racially based. And that's where I think Christians have to be discerning, and they have to be wise to know, how do we properly think about these types of issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if we're allowing, again, the government to call the shots, government hates competition. And if we have allowed the state to reign supreme in the area of education and formulating our worldview, and then hoped that an hour or two of Sunday school is going to fix it, I know is going to be adequate to inform a Christian worldview, we've been sorely mistaken. I think we see the poisonous fruit of that has taken over the last, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 generations now at this point. And I don't say that to, in some way trumpet that, those of us who are homeschooling are out here, we're the heroes, we've got everything right. We make mistakes too, and we're learning as we go. But that's one of the things that I actually love about the whole concept of home education, is that you get to learn right along with your kids, and you get to reinforce what you understand about the Bible. God is revealing, just for myself as an example, God has revealed new things to me about the way he is, in new clarity, how he is my father, how he is my good father, through parenting, through working with our kids at the kitchen table or in our backyard, or however, the freedom that you have when you're home educating, which is a beautiful gift. But the parents learn right along with the children, and we're building that relationship. And there's so many great benefits to approaching education from a personal standpoint in your own home with your own kids. It's an amazing thing. And that we continually outsource that, I think, has has clearly had a downhill effect. And it's not as though this is unintentional. This isn't just, good intentions gone awry. I think if you look into the history of the public education system and the main influencers, to coin a phrase, of that, it's very clearly, many of them were very clearly opposed to a traditional Christian or Western understanding of the way the world should work. And they looked to that next generation and said, okay, if we can understand, if we can train the little's brains, and then we can switch this way of the world. We can start to topple some of these institutions that we're not fond of. We can unmake the world. We can start to dismantle, which is, again, terms that we've now heard over and over again being spoken of openly. It's not an accident that we see it having taken root in and now producing fruit through the public school system.
Yeah, I think the statistics even show that. If you look at Generation Z, which are basically young people who were born, like, say, 1997 to the present, those young people vote Democratic, or they say that they will vote Democratic at about 61% of the population, and only 15% of them actively will oppose homosexual marriage. So when you look at each of the generations from Gen Z working backwards to Gen X and the millennials, and then Gen X, and then the baby boomers, you become more conservative the older that you are within that demographic spectrum. And the younger the age, the more leftist, the more socialist, the more progressive, the more anti-Christian your perspective. And so the government schools have increasingly been effective at turning younger generations against the more conservative values of their parents. And you just look at it and see how that plays out. So, I mean, as soon as the Gen Z generation, if this trend continues, is old enough to be the dominant force within the population, you're looking at 60%, 61% of all of the population voting Democrat. They're going to carry every election moving forward in general. I mean, obviously, you'll still have some states, some areas that are going to remain more conservative, but just on a national level, the Democratic Party is going to end up totally controlling the political process in a very few short years when you look at the trajectory. And so the only way to really combat that is that you have to get children out of that system and have them educated in a privately funded environment of private Christian schools or privately funded homeschools, where you get to control the content of the curriculum. Because any environment in which the government is paying for the schooling of the child, they get to call the shots. They get to dictate what is taught in that environment. And of course, they want to promote their values, which are in contrast and antithetical to biblical values. So we really only have currently about 12% of the population that is choosing Christian education for their children. There's about 8% who choose private Christian schools, and about 4% who choose homeschooling. So it's and this is not the population. This is even within the Christian community.
Okay.
That among the Christians, only 12% are choosing private Christian schools and homeschooling among Christians. And so we have just a much more dominant anti-Christian perspective within the country. And there's no way that changes unless those percentages change, where people are able to find ways to opt their children out of government-controlled education.
Israel Wayne is our esteemed guest today, a well-respected and experienced voice in the area of home education, parents' rights, policy, and in particular, a biblical worldview about all of these things. Speaker, author, many times over, and I will link to his website down below as well. The concerns, Israel, that I think I have most is, again, how can we as the church get united on things like this? How can we start equipping parents? How can we start supporting parents to do what God is calling us to do? So I think education is the first element of that. People don't know what they don't know. And so we as the church need to be educating parents and empowering them to help take on some of these responsibilities, because the world around you not only tells you that you can't, but that it's ridiculous to even try. That's just silly. Why would parents want to teach their own kids? That's what the government's for. Nope. Nope. Actually, that in itself is the strange and ridiculous point of view from a historical perspective. But I'd love to get into some of that in terms of practical application. What can we do? What do we need to understand about God's view of education? And how can we then equip parents, Christian parents? So let's just start there. Let's start amongst ourselves and get our own house in order to help improve this situation, to practically for parents to do what they need to do in their own households, because that, I believe, is how we change the culture. We'll do that right after this. You're listening to Faith Works Live. In today's world, security has never been more vital. And at FaithWorks Live, we're proud to partner with VeriGuard Security. It's a professional physical security service, and they're really raising the bar in security and private investigations. Whether you need a team of professional officers to protect what you have worked hard to build, or their mobile security units for multiple properties or large locations, from business or corporate properties to your home or neighborhood. Perhaps you've got an event coming up. They secure quality security coverage for events large and small, because it's about peace of mind and protecting you, your family, your team, and your property. Settle for nothing less than the best when it comes to your security. You shouldn't have to compromise. When it comes to security, you can trust VeriGuard. Contact them today at verigard.us. That's VARA guard.us. For security service, you can trust VeriGuard. So glad you're with us here on FaithWorks Live. Rebecca's my name, but you know that already because we're old friends. And I am speaking to Israel Wayne today. He's an excellent guest. I'm so glad that he's been able to talk with us. And we're talking about home education, parents' rights, and specifically a biblical view on education. You can check out his work at familyrenewal.org. That's familyrenewal.org. And Israel, I know you've been doing this for a long time. And I saw you post something about how you're qualified to speak on many topics in terms of worldview and theology, and you're addressing homeschooling a lot. And I wonder, are you okay with that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I have been writing on and talking about education for so long that a lot of people have kind of put me in a box. A lot of people refer to me as the homeschool guy.
Yeah.
But I actually have written a couple of theological books. I wrote a book called Questions God Asks, Questions Jesus Asks. I have a new Bible doctrine curriculum called Foundations in Faith that is for high school students. It's like a 36-week course. 5 lessons a day for 36 weeks, kind of an introduction to systematic theology for high school. I have just written a catechism that's going to be coming out, a non-denominational catechism that'll be published by Master Books. And so I've written parenting books, and I've taught on Christian apologetics. There's a lot of different things that I have written and talked about. So I do feel a little restrained sometimes when people think of me only within the confines of education topics. But it is something that I think is vital. It is important. I wrote a book called Education, Does God Have an Opinion? And this book, I think, is going to be the one that I'll be remembered for 40 years from now when I'm dead and gone, because I think it's one of the most comprehensive books on the market related to biblical philosophy of education. And it's a book that I really want pastors to get a hold of. I want Christians who believe the Bible is the final authority to read it, because most people have an experience and an opinion about education, but they don't have a biblical theology of education. Almost no one does. And most pastors, I guarantee you, do not have a biblical theology related to education. They just have a default position of, this is how I was schooled, and so I will defend the government school system because that's how I grew up.
Yeah,
and then I have another book on education that I wrote as well. It's called Answers for Homeschooling, the top 25 questions critics ask. And in that book, I really try to deal with the issue of, what are the top objections that people raise to home education? So you have I'm not qualified to teach my child. What about socialization? How do you, aren't you supposed to school like the public school? How do you know the laws in your state? The one intramural discussion that we have within the church, of course, is the salt and light argument that we need to have our children in the public schools to be missionaries and evangelists. And then just all the practical things of
Mhm.
what about sports? Aren't your children going to be missing out if they're not going to a government school? How can you give your child the same level of quality academic education, especially if you're not a certified teacher, et cetera, et cetera. So really all of the objections that people raise to homeschooling, I've heard them thousands of times in my lifetime because I was not only homeschooled, but my wife, and as was my wife, but we have 11 children that we have homeschooled from birth, and I've worked professionally in the homeschool world for over 30 years. And so my mother was one of the founding pioneers of the homeschool movement, so I've just been in it my whole life.
Mhm.
So I wanted to really just take all of those objections that people have and address them with research and studies, because we actually have studied us on almost all of these issues. So it doesn't have to be relegated to my opinion versus your opinion. We actually have research and stats and data about all of these topics. So the Answers for Homeschooling book is, I would say, fairly research driven. The Education, Does God Have an Opinion book is more philosophical and theological. So they're quite different. They complement each other quite well. And at our familyrenewal.org website, we have a web store where people can purchase my books. And if they get them from our web store, I always sign it because that's something Amazon won't do. And so we always send out autographed copies of the books ordered from our website. But we actually have a bundle. I think it's just called Christian Education Bundle, where if you get both of those books, there's a discount. And so, actually probably be cheaper than Amazon, plus you get them signed. But yes, I think that from my viewpoint, if we don't capture the next generation, if we keep losing 70% of our youth, which is what Barna Research, Pew Research, and Lifeway have all said in 3 independent studies, that we lose 70% of our youth before high school graduation, that they walk away from the faith, we're not going to have Christians left to debate theology with, or to, we're not going to have missionaries and evangelists, because you can't continue to lose young people at that percentage and have a future for Christianity.
Mhm.
Now, I will say, I believe that we will always have a remnant. We will always have people who will be faithful to Christ, but we will no longer have the same kind of cultural influence that we have had and that we've enjoyed over the past 400 years here in the United States, if this trend continues. And so the one hope that a lot of the researchers are pointing to, including Dr. George Barna, who's the leading researcher on all things related to the Christian church in the United States, he has said that there's not 2 paths out of this. There's only one path, and that is that Christian parents must learn to disciple their own children, give them a biblical worldview, and stop depending on the church to get it done in the 1 hour a week that we give them. So, we're thankful for the church. We're grateful for what the church provides in a supplementary role. But God never commanded the church to disciple our children. He commanded us to do it.
Mm.
So it's really our job to disciple our children. And we need to stop just hoping that other people will do it for us.
Let's put a pin in the salt and light argument and return to it before the end of the conversation, because we should address that. So many people, though, I think, are limited by their own experience and specifically justifying their own experience. So we, live in a great small town in the middle of salt of the earth, Iowa. They're very proud of their public schools, and so many of the people we know love and support their public school, and that's great as far as it goes. I'm glad they've had a wonderful experience. If you then choose to homeschool your children and say, just hypothetically, that for your Christian worldview, you believe, that God has called you to homeschool your kids, you get a lot of funny looks and you get a lot of, personal comments, because the implication of you choosing that for your children says something about choices that other people have made, that your fellow Christians have made. Concerns about public schools inevitably turn personal, at least anecdotally. That's according to my own experience. So I think it is important for the church to come together around an understanding of what God has to say, to elevate it beyond your opinion, my opinion, your experience, my opinion about your experience. And this is just what we've done for the last 100 years or 2 in our society. I don't think that's a solid theological argument. I think that obviously the degenerated state that we're leaving kids to in public schools, even if you have a better than average school, they still refuse to allow God's word in the building. They are not being influenced. They're actively shunning influence from God, from the church, from Christian thinkers, from even just people being allowed to identify openly as Christians. And because nature abhors a vacuum, the enemy has swooped in. And what are the things that are influencing our children? We see radical gender ideology, radical confusion. You have open race baiting in classrooms, not to mention issues of security, students not being physically safe, teachers being assaulted in the hallways. A student gets mad that you took their cell phone because it was against the rules, and they're beating teachers down in the hallways, and they can't do anything about it. Even law enforcement doesn't get called some of the time. And that's happening just in schools in our area that we know about. It's not theoretical. And so the situation in public education right now is untenable. And I think, though, as the church, we can't just, shake our heads and look the other way and wish that it were different. We have to present people with viable alternatives and practically empowering parents. Like I said, I think that is the solution. There is a partnership that can be played between families and churches. But I do believe, as you said, that education is primarily the responsibility of the family, of the parents toward their kids. I mean, that's what I believe God's word says. What does God have to say about education, and can we produce a more biblical worldview?
Well, the first thing we have to do is back out and think about the question of jurisdiction. So there's a biblical theology of authority, and we have to start with the premise that God is the highest authority in the universe, that there's no authority that is higher than God. God created everything, so he has the right to define it. He has the right to give it its boundaries, its policies, its regulations, if you will. And so God, as the supreme authority in the universe, has delegated limited authority on earth to accomplish his purposes. And so God has created different spheres of government on the earth. The first form of government that God created on the earth was the family. And then the second was the civil government, and then eventually the church. And each one of these is a governmental structure that has authority given from God, and it has certain duties and mandates, responsibilities, but also limits. And so the biblical theology that is given in Scripture related to the civil government in the New Testament is in 1 Peter chapter 2 and Romans 13, where Peter says that God established the civil government for two reasons. Number one, to punish evildoers, and second, to promote those who do what is right. And so this is reiterated again in Romans 13, where Paul says that every form of government that is regulating human behavior here on earth is ultimately the idea of God. It's God's concept. He created that. It's not ultimately the creation or invention of man. And so because of that, it is accountable to God for what it does. And so Paul says that it's supposed to be limited, and that we're to pay taxes for government to do the work that God gave it to do, which is to bear the sword, to be an agent of God's wrath upon the evildoer, and to punish those who do what is wrong. So the responsibility of civil government, according to Scripture, is important. It's vital. It's God ordained, but it's very limited. They're supposed to punish evildoers and protect the citizens. The family has the responsibility of the care and upbringing of children. And the church has the responsibility of creating disciples and teaching and training people to do the work of the ministry. That's in Ephesians chapter 4, where it talks about how church leadership is given by God to help build up and equip the saints to do the work of the ministry. Not to do the work of the ministry for the saints, but to train them up and teach them how to do the work of the ministry. And so when we think about education and to whom the upbringing and rearing of children has been given, there are 0 verses in the Bible where God tells the government to have anything to do with the raising of children. They're not supposed to, change their diapers and sing them lullabies and nurse them and tuck them in at night and teach them how to walk and talk and tie their shoes and teach them their colors and numbers and shapes and letters and their math facts and their science and their history. That's never a responsibility God gave to the government. So we have, a limited view of what the government is supposed to do from Scripture. They're not supposed to be in the babysitting business. They are supposed to bear a sword and punish the evildoers and be God's agents of wrath on those who do what is wrong. And so as long as these different spheres of government and authority stay in their place and do what God has given them to do, society works very well. But as soon as they start trying to do the job of the others, it becomes dysfunctional.
Mhm.
So when you look at 6,000 years of human history, the norm for all of human history has been that parents would teach their own children. And then, somewhere around 170 years ago, we started to have this introduction of a statist view of education that was largely introduced by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto in his 10th plank. Well, we need a free system of public schools. And then he says we must replace home education with social. And he told us in the manifesto why this was important. And he said it was because that system of public schools would destroy the family.
Mm.
We're ignorant of history. We think that this concept of government-controlled schools is an American idea, that it's somehow in the Constitution, which it's not. It's mentioned, education is mentioned nowhere in the U.S. Constitution, or we think it's a biblical idea. And nowhere in the scripture does God give the responsibility for education to the government, and nowhere in the Constitution do we find that. Where we find this concept of a free system of public schools is in the Communist Manifesto. So people say, well, we can't just abolish the government school system. We need it. It's necessary to have a system of public schools. And what would we do if we didn't have public schools? And I said, what would we do? Well, this is a new, novel, experimental concept. Like, people look at homeschooling as though it's this radical, revolutionary idea that, wow, you think you can teach your own children? You're not a government agent. You're not a certified government stamped official.
Yeah.
How do you think that you could possibly teach your own child? The fact that we think that way shows just how completely immersed and indoctrinated into Marxism we are, and don't even realize it.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that the government should have anything at all to do with education is only 170 years old. And in all of human history, it is the new kid on the block. That's the idea that we should be suspicious of. That's the idea that is revolutionary and seditionary. And so the concept that parents could teach their own children, that's just how everyone has viewed it for all of human history. So I think part of it is we just have to back out and get the big view. But we're ignorant of theology, we're ignorant of scripture, and then we're also ignorant of history. When you're ignorant of scripture and you're ignorant of history, it sets you up for enslavement. And this is really where we are within the Christian community today. And this is why my book, Education, Does God Have an Opinion, is so important, to help us, to recalibrate, if you will, a proper thinking on this topic from a biblical framework.
Mm-hmm. I'm smiling when you said that, not because I take joy in the ludicrous lies we believed, but that I've literally seen teachers at school board meetings, before congressional hearings, breaking out in hysteria at the idea that parents ought to have a say, even a minimal say, over things like what books are available in, that we shouldn't have pornographic content available for kindergartners. I thought we could all agree on that. That is a matter of extreme concern. And there are teachers that have gone on the record, on camera, hyperventilating over the idea that parents might have a say, might have just as much of a say as teachers, because they're not qualified. They're not state certified. You know what I have a PhD in? My kid. You know who loves my kid more than you? Me. You know who made that kid? God, through me. Like, that's how this works. And the fact that we don't look at that for the ridiculousness that it is, and that the state then lays claim. And like you said, we're looked at as the rebels, the revolutionaries, for wanting to, go back to the model that has worked for the last several millennia for the perpetuation of the species, as well as the inculcation of a biblical worldview. And so I've got two questions. I think one, the objection that I hear from outsiders, the outside argument for that is, well, you're just brainwashing your kids in a different ideology. And I have seen in black and white people say that anyone who is a Christian who removes their child from public education, from that influence, and is, in their words, indoctrinating, that we're the indoctrinating ones, we're the crazy ones. And some states are going so far as to remove, or talk about, broach, legally removing children from parents' custody based on things like a biblical understanding of gender. If you refuse to go along with gender dysphoria, gender delusion, then the state is coming in as an aggressive actor to remove the child from your care. That's happening, or is being broached in states like California and Oregon and Washington. That's the argument that I hear from the outside. And it's so radical, but there are actually people that believe that. And I don't see those two things coexisting. But I definitely don't want that thought influencing our children. I don't see how, as Christians, we can act like that's okay and that won't have an impact on how our kids are being raised.
Well, ironically, if we raise each generation within the government school, then each generation will grow up thinking that the government should school our children. And so, in order to break out of the matrix, we actually have to have some generation that decides to be quote unquote radical and get their children out. And so, I always use this illustration of if we're on a train going south and our intention is to go north, the way to go north is not to run as fast as we know how in a northerly direction on a southbound train, which is what most parents are doing by going to PTA meetings and, yelling and trying to make their voice heard. The way to go north is to get off the southbound train and find a train going north. And what that train looks like is privately funded biblical worldview education. And so that's what we need to encourage the next generation so that they don't grow up basically being indoctrinated by the anti-Christian theology, if you will. Theology is the study of God, and indoctrination simply means to teach someone a doctrine. And so every educational system is at its root a system of indoctrination. The question is it true doctrine or is it false doctrine? Is it a false concept of God or is it a true concept of God? And so the government schools indoctrinate their children into a false doctrine. We want to indoctrinate our children into a correct and true doctrine. Every system is theological in that it makes assumptions about God. And the government schools say either emphatically God does not exist, or they say we can't know if God exists, and therefore God is irrelevant to everything that we study here. But to say that God is irrelevant to everything is not a neutral position. The Christian philosopher Gordon Clark made the statement that, what are we to say to the government school who says, "Oh God, we neither obey nor disobey your commandments. Oh God, we neither acknowledge or deny your existence. We're strictly neutral." God does not see that as neutral. God sees that as hostile. And another theologian, deceased now, R.C. Sproul, talked about how there is no possibility of neutrality in education because all education makes some kind of an assumption about God, and God is the standard by which we judge all issues of ethics, of morality, of right and wrong, and so forth. And so he said that to take a posture that claims that God is irrelevant is not neutral, because an irrelevant God is the same as no God at all. And so when we teach students that God has nothing to do with any of real life, we create this kind of dualism, sacred secular dualism, where we basically teach children that God has somehow to do with our personal salvation, so we go to heaven when we die, but that all the rest of life, our finances, our employment, our understanding of history, language, communication, relationships, everything else in life is to be devoid of God. That is not a biblical framework. It's not a biblical worldview. It's not religiously neutral. It's religiously hostile. And going back to what you're talking about with these supposedly good public schools, in my mind, and I know this is radical, and it takes a while for people to really come to see this because they're so indoctrinated in the necessity that we have to have Marxist schools. I just can't imagine not having a school system that is funded by forced redistribution of wealth, that is ruled by compulsory attendance laws that make children attend these schools by force of law. They just can't imagine there not being that kind of a system. And so, in my view, which again, I understand is not the common, even Christian view, I look at it and say, what do you end up with if you even had the perfect utopian government school that taught all the nice little values that we want to teach our children? You still end up with a Marxist, socialistic redistribution of wealth government school. And I don't want that. So from my viewpoint, reforming the government school system is not a win to me. Because the best possible solution, if we reform a government school, is at the end of the day, we still have a government school. To me, the problem is not preeminently what the government schools teach. That's not the main thing that I object to. The main thing I object to is the existence of government schools. And I understand that that's a really big thought for a lot of people to consider, to step back and ask, should we even have government controlled schools and government regulated education? My answer is emphatically no,
Mm.
that there's no place biblically and there's no place constitutionally for the government to be in charge of education, because the government does not have any money. The government only has what it takes from some people to redistribute to other people. Forced redistribution of wealth is inherently Marxist. It's not constitutional. It's not Christian. Does not fit within the concepts of liberty. We need to step back and really think about it far more fundamentally than we do.
Mm-hmm.
I think for most parents, they just look at the fruit of the tree, and they look at the fact that their child is being taught transgenderism, and they're offended by that. And they say, I don't want my child to have a teenage boy in the girls' bathroom when my daughter is there. Well, I get that. I understand that. That's a problem. But to me, that's a fruit on the tree. It's not the root of the tree. To me, the root of the question is the government supposed to be in charge of raising children?
Mm-hmm.
And if they're not, then we need to look at that. We need to back up and really rethink this whole issue far more fundamentally than we have, because then we start to ask ourselves, in terms of reforming this system, how beneficial is it, even if we win? Let me try to put it this way. There are some institutions that we as Christians have an obligation to reform, and those would be institutions that God has formed. So if God formed an institution like marriage, like the church, and we see that these institutions are dying, that they are decaying, that they're falling apart, that they're in a state of lethargy, we have a moral obligation to seek to reform those institutions. The family needs reformation. The church needs reformation. But there are some institutions that I don't want to reform. I don't want to try to Christianize. I don't want to have a Christian version of sex trafficking. I don't want Christian mafia or Christian street gangs. I don't want Christian drug trafficking. Like, these are institutions that God did not form, and therefore I will not waste any of my time seeking to reform them. I don't want to have a campaign to say, we need clean needles for drug users so that they don't get diseases. I don't want to have a reform of the abortion industry to where we want to provide more safe and legal abortions, so that women can kill their babies with less harmful physical effects to themselves.
Right.
There are some institutions that simply need to be abolished. And so in my mind, when I think about government funded, government controlled education, this is never something that I think of as being in the category of something we need to reform. God didn't create it. God didn't encourage us to participate in it. God was not part of the founding of the government school system. That was Karl Marx. And so I don't want a Christian version of Marxism. I want to see Marxism abolished. That's my desire. I want to see sex traffickers and drug traffickers and the pornography industry and all of that. I want to see that go away. I don't want to see more conservative versions of it. And I think this is where we're wrong-headed when we have this mentality that we want to try to prop up and preserve the government school system. When people say, oh, but we have such a wonderful public school system in our small town, to me, that's an oxymoron. I don't want a wonderful Marxist school. And so I understand that the ideas that I am expressing here seem radical, but I'm just going to throw this out. And I know that this will take people a long time to think about this, and it may be months or maybe even years down the road before it actually makes sense to them. But the fact that you think that there should be a Marxist, socialist, forced redistribution of wealth, government-controlled school system shows you how indoctrinated into Marxism you are because of your government education. The fact that you think that's a category that should exist in the universe shows that you are way more indoctrinated by your government schooling than you know. And so this is where, as Christians, we have to have a level of humility to step back and say, wow, we think we're conservatives. We think that we're anti-socialist, but actually most Christians that I know who say that they're anti-socialist, as soon as I start asking them, do you believe the government should be involved in healthcare? Well, yes. Do you believe the government should be involved in schooling and education? Well, yes. They actually are for all of the socialist programs, but they say they're anti-socialist. And so I think these are all examples of how we've just been saturated into a socialistic ethos or milieu, and we generally accept the basic premises of forced redistribution of wealth, all the while claiming that we're against it. Anyway, that was a little bit wordy. Give that some time, like put that on the shelf, come back to it down the road. Just think about that, pull that out every once in a while and look at it and say, at the end of the day, if we reform the government school systems, all you really have is a slightly better Marxist government school. Is that really what we want? My vote is no.
Pulling no punches. Israel Wayne is our guest. And oh man, there's so much more we could talk about in so many different directions that I know time is not on my side today. So I guess we'll just have to have you back. So if this conversation's been challenging, I'd love to hear your feedback. Let me know in the comments. Send me an email. It's RebeccaHaynie@outlook.com. And you can let me know what you think, what your experience has been, questions you might have for Israel, because he's already said he'd come back. So I'll take him up on that and we'll present your questions next time around. Until then, we have a mission. So let's be about it. Our mission is to love God, to serve people, and to live free. This is Faith Works Live.